It's Saturday, February 28, 2026. And if you are listening to this right now, chances are you've been doom scrolling since about 4 o'clock this morning, just like we have.
Yeah, I haven't slept. I mean, the world feels fundamentally different this morning, doesn't it?
It really does. We've spent, years on this deep dive talking about red lines and shadow wars and the theory of deterrence. But what we are watching unfold right now, this is the thing we always said was the absolute worst case scenario, and it's actually happening.
It is. We are witnessing a historical pivot point. And I don't use that phrase lightly. What started before dawn this morning in the Middle East isn't just a skirmish. It's not a message-sending exercise.
Right. It's a massive structural attempt to alter the reality of the region permanently. We are talking about joint U.S.-Israeli strikes, Operations Roaring Lion and Epic Fury.
The reports are just staggering. Over 500 targets hit inside Iran. And the big rumor, the one that is absolutely consuming every single news cycle right now, is the potential death of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Which is the headline that just stops the world. If true, and we really have to keep stressing this, it is currently unconfirmed by the Iranians. But if true, it changes the calculus of global politics instantly.
Instantly.
Yeah.
But as we always do here, we need to look past that breaking news ticker. The headline is just the explosion, right? The story's the fuse, and that fuse has been burning for a very long time.
Exactly. Our mission today is to cut through this intense fog of war. We want to unpack the tactics, the hardware, which, by the way, is terrifyingly advanced, and the strategy that led us to this specific Saturday.
We've got a massive stack of sources today, but the core of our analysis is based on a really detailed dossier titled Barak Face. It's a timeline of actions in the U.S.-Israel-Iran conflict.
Yeah, that document is crucial because it tracks the escalation chronologically. It helps us see the actual pattern. We aren't just looking at a random bombing campaign today. We're looking at the culmination of a failed diplomatic and military process.
A process that really started to crumble about 3 years ago.
So let's get right into it. But before we talk about the missiles flying today specifically, I think we need to address the elephant in the room, or rather the elephant from last year.
You're talking about the failure of June 2025.
Right. The dossier calls it the 12-day war. And honestly, looking at the timeline, today isn't a new war. It's the second half of a match that everyone thought was already over.
That is the most important insight to start with for anyone trying to make sense of this. To understand the sheer ferocity of Operation Epic Fury today, why they are hitting 500 targets instead of just 50, you have to understand the deep frustration of 2025.
Let's rewind to that context, because if you don't understand the rules that were broken, you can't understand the game being played now. Before 2023, there was a status quo.
The shadow war.
Exactly. For decades, this conflict had unwritten rules. On the Iranian side, the doctrine was called forward defense.
And the logic there was simple and, frankly, effective. Fight the enemy anywhere but Iran.
Right. Fight them in Gaza. Fight them in Beirut. Fight them in Yemen or Baghdad.
Use proxies like Hamas and Hezbollah to bleed Israel and the U.S., but keep the Persian rug clean. It's the ultimate outsourcing model.
Plausible deniability. It wasn't us. It was those guys over there. We just gave them the rockets.
Exactly. And on the Israeli side, their doctrine was known as mowing the grass.
Which, every time I hear that phrase, it just strikes me as such a grim metaphor.
It's incredibly grim, but it's descriptive of a very specific strategic mindset. It implies that the threat terrorism, militia buildups, weapons smuggling is like a weed.
You can't stop it from growing.
Right. You can't permanently stop it. So you just go in every few years with airstrikes or a limited ground incursion, cut it down to a manageable level, and accept that you'll have to do it all over again in 3 to 5 years.
Because you don't try to pull the weeds out by the root. That requires digging up the whole garden, which is way too messy and costly.
And the U.S. was playing its own game alongside this, mostly relying on containment and economic sanctions, trying to put the weeds in a box, essentially.
But then the dossier points to 2023 as the moment the lawnmower essentially broke.
October 7, 2023, that was the catalyst. When Hamas attacked Israel, it set off a chain reaction that completely destroyed that shadow war framework.
Because Iran praised the attack, obviously, but they initially tried to stay out of the direct line of fire, but the escalation ladder just started climbing so fast.
Let's look at the timeline here. April 1st, 2024. This feels like the first real crack in the dam.
Yeah, that's when Israel struck the Iranian consulate in Damascus.
That was a massive signal. It was a decapitation strategy. Israel was saying, diplomatic immunity does not cover military commanders who are actively planning attacks against us. They killed high-ranking IRGC officers there.
And that directly led to April 13 and 14 of 2024, the first direct attack. Iran fires over 300 drones and missiles from Iranian soil directly at Israel.
And 99% of them were intercepted. At the time, a lot of people mocked it. They said Iran's military was weak.
But historically, that was the moment the taboo broke.
Precisely. Before April 2024, Iran and Israel did not fire directly at each other from their own sovereign territory. Once that psychological seal was broken, the barrier to what we are seeing today was completely removed.
Then we had another exchange in October 2024, Israel's largest direct attack at the time, going after S-300 air defenses. But this brings us to the 12-day war of June 2025.
That dress reversal that went horribly wrong.
Walk us through that, because I think a lot of people, myself included, thought that settled things for a while.
June 2025 was triggered when the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, declared Iran was an explicit violation of their agreements. A secret enrichment site was revealed.
So Israel struck unilaterally first, right?
Yes, and then the U.S. entered the fight a few days later. They used B-2 Spirit bombers, striking the deeply buried underground facility at Fordo.
And the whole thing lasted 12 days. It ended in a ceasefire. I remember the headlines were all saying, crisis averted, a nuclear program set back years.
But look at the notes in our source material. What actually happened after the dust settled? The dossier explicitly says enrichment was halted, but it resumed. The regime survived.
So mowing the grass just didn't work.
It failed completely. They mowed the grass and it grew back thicker, faster, and harder. The Iranians learned a crucial lesson from 2025.
What was that?
They realized that if they could just weather the initial storm for about 2 weeks, the international community would scream for a ceasefire to protect the oil markets, and they could just go right back to digging deeper tunnels.
That failure to fully neutralize the nuclear threat and leaving the regime intact in 2025 is directly responsible for the sheer violence we are seeing today.
Yes. The U.S. and Israel realized that half measures just bought Iran time to dig deeper. They essentially said, we're not doing 2025 again.
So the goalpost moved entirely. In 2025, the goal was degradation. Just slow them down.
But today, looking at the target list from Roaring Lion and Epic Fury, the goal is clearly elimination. They aren't trying to slow the clock, they're trying to smash the clock to pieces.
Which brings us to the immediate build-up to this morning, February 2026. There was a last-ditch diplomatic attempt recently, wasn't there? The Geneva talks.
There were, and they failed miserably. Iran flatly rejected the zero enrichment demand, and the U.S. only offered very minimal sanctions relief in return. It was a complete non-starter.
And that's when the U.S. strategy shifted. The dossier calls it a shift from deterrence to an attritional campaign aimed at the long-term weakening of the IRGC.
An attritional campaign, it sounds incredibly heavy.
Like World War I trench warfare, but with stealth bombers.
It basically means you stop trying to scare them into behaving, and you start trying to slowly, methodically grind them down until they physically cannot function as a state or a military power anymore.
And there were signals that this was coming, right? Even before the bombs fell today.
Social media was absolutely buzzing. We had reports on X indicating that strike preparations were actually postponed from the previous weekend.
Right, and we saw the deployment of U.S. B-52 bombers a bit earlier.
Initially, the White House said those B-52s were deployed for deterrence. But as of this morning, those deterrents transitioned into active combatants.
Okay, let's unpack the anatomy of this strike. This is Section 3 of our deep dive. We have these two operation names. Operation Roaring Lion for Israel and Operation Epic Fury for the U.S.
Just the names themselves tell you something about the intent. Epic Fury, Roaring Lion. This is an Operation Gentle Warning. This is designed to be loud and devastating.
The scope is what gets me. The source says this is the largest sortie in Israeli Air Force history. Around 200 jets.
Try to imagine the logistics of that for a second. 200 fighter jets in the air simultaneously.
It's hard to even picture.
That's not just pilots and cockpits. That's refueling tankers doing continuous loops over the desert. That's AWCS command control planes managing the airspace traffic.
It's electronic warfare planes jamming enemy radars.
Exactly. It is a massive, highly synchronized armada. And to coordinate that with U.S. heavy bombers flying in from bases in Europe or the U.S., the complexity of that timing is mind-boggling.
Let's walk through the timeline. Phase 1, this was the pre-dawn surprise.
It kicked off roughly at 05:57 UTC, which is just before 9:30 a.m. in Iran.
So the morning rush hour is just getting underway.
The targets were incredibly widespread. Tehran, Isfahan, which is a major nuclear hub, Qom, Tabriz.
But one specific target in Tehran stands out above all the others.
The leadership compound. The dossier mentions specifically that 7 missiles struck Khamenei's compound in the Jamhuri area near the IRGC headquarters.
This is the kill shot moment. Israeli officials are currently claiming Khamenei's body was found in the rubble. Meanwhile, the Iranian Foreign Ministry is vehemently denying it, claiming he's perfectly safe.
This is your classic fog of war. But notice the specificity of the strike. 7 missiles.
Yeah, that's not a warning.
You don't fire 7 precision missiles at a single building unless you are absolutely determined to level it down to the foundation and vaporize everything inside it. This indicates the goal wasn't just to send a message. The goal was decapitation of the regime.
If that is confirmed, it changes everything. But there is a very dark side to this phase one as well, the civilian costs. We absolutely cannot gloss over this.
No, we can't. We have verified reports of a girls' elementary school in Manab being hit.
It's just awful. The source says 51 to 85 students and staff were killed. Total Iranian death toll right now is over 200.
It is horrific. And from a purely strategic perspective, it complicates the narrative significantly for the attackers.
Because the U.S. and Israel are framing this as a precision war against a dangerous regime.
Right. But images of a bombed elementary school that fuels the counter-narrative of Western aggression and war crimes, that creates rage on the streets.
And rage is a very powerful fuel. When citizens see that, they don't blame their own government for hiding assets in civilian areas. They blame the planes dropping the bombs.
Let's move to phase 2, the mourning phase. This is where the U.S. formally enters the kinetic fight.
At about 06.15 UTC. Ceasing talk initiates epic fury.
Notice the targets they chose here. They didn't just double-tap the nuclear sites in Isfahan. They went after naval assets.
They hit the IRGC frigate Jemaran and the Imam Ali Navy base in Chabahar. I found this interesting. Why the Navy? I thought this whole thing was about stopping the nuclear program.
It's a major strategy shift. This isn't just about nukes anymore. It's about destroying Iran's ability to project power at sea.
Because even if you destroy the nuclear centrifuges, Iran can still harass global shipping in the Persian Gulf.
Exactly. They can still close the Strait of Hormuz using their frigates and those swarms of fast attack boats. By sinking the Jemarat and gutting the naval bases, the U.S. is trying to strip Iran of its ability to hold the global oil supply hostage.
It's essentially saying, we are taking away all your conventional toys, too.
You are effectively grounded. It's an attritional strategy playing out in real time.
And then comes phase 3, the messaging war. Because in 2026, you don't just drop bombs, you drop content.
We saw an 8-minute video from former and now current President Trump posted on Truth Social.
He really didn't mince words. He demanded the IRGC surrender for amnesty or face certain death.
It's a massive psychological operation. He is offering an off-ramp directly to the soldiers, surrender and live, while simultaneously calling for the Iranian people to overthrow the regime from within.
He's trying to drive a wedge between the ordinary citizens and the mullahs.
Bypassing the diplomats entirely and talking directly to the young man holding the rifle.
And Netanyahu released a video echoing that exact sentiment. He confirmed the joint strikes and called Iran an existential threat that simply had to be eliminated.
But, the most effective messaging today might not have been a video from a politician at all. It was the cyber warfare.
Oh, this part is wild. Iranian internet connectivity dropped to 4% nationwide.
Basically completely dark.
And get this, hacked prayer apps were sending surrender messages directly to Iranians.
Just imagine that for a second. You open your phone to read your daily prayers, and you get a push notification telling you your leadership is dead and you need to give up.
It's honestly dystopian.
It's modern asymmetric warfare.
Yeah.
You disconnect the leadership from the military commanders by killing the internet, and then you inject your own terrifying message directly into the pockets of the population.
It creates instant panic, confusion, and paranoia. A soldier on the ground doesn't know if his general is alive. He doesn't know if Tehran has fallen.
He only knows what the hacked app on his phone is telling him.
I want to really geek out for a second on the hardware. This is section 4 of our deep dive, because the machinery involved in these strikes is just mind-blowing, and the dossier gives us some specifics that we really need to understand to grasp how this happens so fast.
It's a brutal showcase of cutting-edge military tech.
Let's start with the aggressors, the U.S. and Israel. We mentioned the F-35I Adir. Now, I know the F-35 is an American stealth fighter, but what makes the Adir variant so special for Israel?
Adir translates to mighty in Hebrew. And these aren't just stock F-35s you buy off the shelf from Lockheed Martin. Israel has heavily modified them with their own proprietary electronic warfare suites.
Okay, electronic warfare. We hear that buzzword a lot in the news, but what does it actually mean in the context of penetrating Iranian airspace?
Think of the Adir as a flying server room. The S-300 air defense system, which is the Russian-made system Iran heavily relies on, looks for specific radar returns to lock onto a target.
Right.
The Israeli mods on the F-35 don't just try to hide the plane passively. They actively feed the S-300 radar system false data.
Like digital gaslighting.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
The radar operator sitting in a bunker on the ground doesn't see a blank screen, which would obviously be suspicious. He sees a clear blue sky. Or maybe he sees a flock of birds.
Well,
Or he sees 50 jets attacking from the completely opposite direction.
it forces the enemy operator to hesitate.
And in modern hypersonic warfare, hesitation is death. That is how those jets got all the way to Tehran untouched for deep penetration strikes. They hacked the eyes of the enemy defenses.
That is incredible. And then you have the heavy hitters, the B-52 Stratofortress and the B-2 Spirit.
The B-52 is essentially a massive bomb truck. It hauls huge amounts of long-range cruise missiles and launches them from a safe standoff distance outside enemy airspace.
But the B-2, that's the scalpel. The source references the B-2's capability for hitting those deep underground bunkers like we saw in 2025.
And to hit a deeply buried bunker, you need a very specific kind of munition, the GBU-57 MOP.
The massive ordnance penetrator, 30,000 pounds.
30,000 pounds of engineered destruction.
That is hard to even visualize. That's like taking 10 Honda Civics, welding them together into a spike, and dropping them from the stratosphere.
It's a bomb the size of a commercial truck, made of heavily hardened steel. And the key is that it does not explode on impact.
Why not?
Because if it exploded on the surface, it would just scratch the paint of a mountain facility like Natan's or Fordo. Those places are buried deep inside solid rock.
Right.
The MOP uses kinetic energy to punch through up to 200 feet of earth and reinforce concrete before the delayed fuse detonates the warhead.
200 feet. That's a 20-story building going straight down into the dirt.
Correct. It essentially turns the mountain itself into the weapon. The shockwave of the blast travels through the bedrock and collapses the underground facility from the inside out. It's really the only conventional weapon on Earth that can touch those deepest Iranian nuclear sites.
They also use JDAMs and precision-guided spice bombs for the surface targets. But Iran isn't just sitting there taking it. What are they throwing back in retaliation?
They are far from defenseless. They have massive stockpiles of ballistic missiles, specifically the Imad and Gajr series, which we saw used in today's retaliation.
But the real concern the dossier highlights is the Fatah 1.
The hypersonic missile.
Right. Now, hypersonic means it travels at Mach 5 or faster, 5 times the speed of sound. But speed isn't actually the main issue here, is it?
No, speed is tough, but maneuverability is the real nightmare. A traditional ballistic missile flies in a predictable parabolic arc, like shooting a basketball.
You can calculate exactly where it's going to be.
Exactly. If you know the arc, your computers can send an interceptor missile to meet it at a specific point in space. It's just complex math. But a hypersonic missile like the Fatah 1 can alter its trajectory in the atmosphere. It can zigzag.
So it's like trying to shoot a bullet with another bullet, but the target bullet is actively dodging.
It makes it incredibly difficult for standard interceptors to calculate a kill solution.
And they also have the sigil, too. The dossier really emphasizes the term solid fuel for these. Why does the fuel type matter so much in a rapid-fire conflict?
Think of an older liquid fuel missile, like a vintage race car. You have to bring a massive tanker truck out to the launch site, connect hoses, and pump highly volatile toxic chemicals into the missile for 45 minutes before you can even think about turning the key.
And in modern satellite warfare, 45 minutes sitting out in the open is an absolute eternity.
You're a sitting duck. An American surveillance satellite sees the heat signature of the truck, and a drone drops a hellfire on you long before you finish pumping the fuel. So liquid fuel is slow and vulnerable.
But a solid fuel missile, like the Sigil 2,
It's completely different. It's pre-packed. Think of it like a giant rifle cartridge. The solid propellant is cast directly into the metal tube at the factory.
so they just roll it out and fire.
You drive the mobile launcher out of a mountain tunnel, lift the boom, and fire in less than 5 minutes. That is why they are so terrifying to hunt down. They shoot and scoot before the U.S. can target the launch site.
And of course, we have to mention the drones. The Shahid-136 kamikaze drones. We've seen these used extensively by Russia in Ukraine for years now.
The mopeds of the sky. They have a range of over 2,000 kilometers. They are cheap, they are slow, they are incredibly loud.
But they are dangerous in massive swarms.
Exactly. If you fire one Shahid, a guy with a heavy machine gun can shoot it down. But if you launch a swarm of 500 simultaneously, 5 or 10 might slip through the defense net, and 5 is more than enough to set a billion-dollar oil refinery completely on fire.
To counter all this, the U.S. and Israel have the Shield, Arrow 3, which is an exo-atmospheric interceptor, meaning it literally hits ballistic missiles out in space.
There's the Iron Dome, for the lower-tier, shorter-range rocket threats.
And the U.S. Navy is using the Aegis combat system on their destroyers with SM-3 interceptors. So Iran fires back. This brings us to Section 5 of the dossier, Operation True Promise 4, the retaliation.
And here is where this strategic map gets really interesting and, frankly, extremely dangerous. Iran's target 1 was Israel.
They launched about 35 ballistic missiles.
And the impact.
Mostly intercepted.
Yeah.
Minor damage to a 9-story building in northern Israel. There were 89 injuries reported, but mostly indirect. Anxiety attacks, people getting hurt, running to bomb shelters, no direct deaths.
So purely militarily, the retaliatory strike on Israel was a failure. The Arrow 3 system did its job perfectly, but we need to look at target 2.
The U.S. and its allies. This is the dangerous expansion. They targeted Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia.
This is a massive structural shift in Iranian tactics. In the past, Iran always tried to avoid hitting the Gulf Arab states directly. They didn't want to unite the entire Arab world against them.
The gloves are completely off.
They hit Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, though that was intercepted. They hit near the Ali Al Salem airport in Kuwait, causing injuries. They hit the 5th Fleet radar in Bahrain.
But the one that really stands out, they hit Dubai. The source mentions the Fairmont, the Palm Hotel catching fire, and explosions in the Palm Jumeirah.
Just try to imagine the scene there. Wealthy tourists lounging on the Palm Jumeirah in Dubai, suddenly watching explosions tear through luxury hotels. This is Iran sending a very clear message. If we burn, the whole region burns with us.
You cannot host U.S. troops and expect to remain safe.
It's a deliberate strategy to fracture the U.S.-Arab alliance. They're trying to make the cost of hosting the American military unbearable for these Gulf states.
They are essentially holding a gun to the head of the global economy. Hitting Dubai isn't a military objective. The Fairmont Hotel is not a military base.
No, it's a symbol of Western tourism, finance, and wealth.
It's economic terrorism, plain and simple.
It is asymmetric warfare at its most cynical. They are saying to the UAE leadership, you let the Americans use Al Dhafra Air Base to launch jets. Fine. We will burn your multi-billion-dollar tourism industry to a ground in an afternoon.
They want the UAE to call the White House in an absolute panic and scream, "Stop the war, you're killing our economy."
But the question is, does that actually work? Or does it just make the Gulf states hate Iran even more?
Historically, it usually backfires. It pushes the Gulf states deeper into the U.S. security umbrella because they realize they physically cannot defend themselves against Iranian ballistic missiles alone.
But in the short term, it absolutely causes panic. And panic is exactly what we are seeing today. The source mentions complete airspace closures in Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar. The entire Middle East is essentially a no-fly zone right now.
Which completely paralyzes global business. It paralyzes international travel.
And critically, the maritime impact. The Strait of Hormuz is closed to shipping.
Let's really double-click on that. The Strait of Hormuz, we hear about it in the news all the time. Why is it the ultimate choke point?
It is a naturally narrow strip of water between Oman and Iran. It's only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and about 20 to 30% of the world's total oil consumption passes through that tiny bottleneck every single day.
So when Iran closes it, or even just threatens to drop naval mines in it, what happens Monday morning when the global markets open?
Absolute chaos. Oil prices could jump to $150, maybe even $200 a barrel overnight.
And marine insurance rates for those massive shipping tankers will skyrocket, making it financially impossible to move goods through the region.
And that hits absolutely everyone. That hits the truck driver in Ohio paying at the pump. It hits the manufacturing factory in Germany. It hits the agricultural farmer in India.
It triggers instant global inflation. It freezes supply chains. It's basically a massive global tax that Iran is levying on the entire world.
They are betting their survival on the idea that the global economy is way too fragile to handle $200 oil. They think the world will force the U.S. to stop the bombing campaign just to get the oil flowing again.
And that puts a massive amount of pressure on China, doesn't it? Because China buys a huge percentage of Iranian oil.
It does. China is in a very tough spot right now.
Mm-hmm.
They are nominally Iran's strategic partner, but their economy desperately needs stability and cheap energy. If their energy prices skyrocket, their manufacturing sector suffers terribly.
So China might actually be the one making the frantic phone calls to Tehran saying, open the strait, or we pull our support.
It's very possible. The road to a ceasefire might actually run through Beijing this time, not Geneva.
That's a fascinating angle. The geopolitical chessboard is just so tightly interconnected. You pull a kinetic thread in Tehran, and the economic sweater unravels in Shanghai.
And in Washington, D.C., too.
Right. Let's talk about the domestic reaction in the U.S. The source material highlights a really interesting piece of media. It says, exclusive interview. Anthropic CEO responds to Trump's comments, Pentagon's position. That's a fascinating juxtaposition. Tech and war.
It highlights how modern warfare is fundamentally a tech war. AI, cyber capabilities, autonomous drones. The Pentagon isn't just working with traditional defense contractors like Lockheed or Raytheon anymore. They are deeply integrated with Silicon Valley.
And the American public? Polls usually show deep resistance to starting new wars in the Middle East. The source literally cites a headline. Only 21% of Americans support the United States initiating an attack on Iran.
But notice the specific framing of that poll. Initiating. This operation is being framed by the administration as a response. A necessary response to the failures of 2025, a response to the secret nuclear sites, a response to the proxy attacks on the Navy.
That's the messaging war coming into play again.
Exactly. If you frame it to the public as initiating an attack, it's hugely unpopular. But if you frame it as eliminating an imminent nuclear threat, the poll numbers might shift significantly in their favor, especially if the military operation is quick.
Because Americans hate long, grinding quagmires. They like quick, decisive victories.
Which brings us back to the duration. The 24-hour war. If it stays a 24-hour or maybe 48-hour operation, it's a huge political win. But it becomes the 24-month war.
Then it's an absolute political and economic disaster.
So where does this leave us? We are at Section 6. The so what? We've covered the massive strikes, the futuristic tech, the fiery retaliation. But how does this actually end?
We are sitting in the most dangerous 24 hours of this entire decade. The military operations are officially described as massive and ongoing. There is no ceasefire in sight. The source dossier outlines 3 potential scenarios for tomorrow. Let's walk through them, because one of these is going to be our reality by next week.
Okay, scenario 1. Regime collapse, the optimistic view. The source gives it a 30 to 50% chance. Honestly, that seems surprisingly high to me.
It is high. But the underlying logic holds up. If Ayatollah Khamenei is truly dead in the rubble, if the top IRGC commanders have been wiped out, if the internet remains down and the Iranian Air Force is a smoking ruin, the central nervous system of the regime is physically severed. And Trump's strategy of saying the Iranians are the boots on the ground comes into play.
Right. If the regular people see that the regime is decapitated, do they rise up? We all saw the woman life freedom movement a few years ago. They have been suppressed by brutal crackdowns. But that anger hasn't evaporated.
If they see the bossy security forces are distracted or their command structure is broken, they might just flood the streets of Tehran.
But the immediate question is, who takes over?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. The succession plan in Iran has always been incredibly opaque. There's been a lot of talk about his son, Mujtaba Khamenei, taking over.
But does Mujtaba actually have the theological respect of the clerics in Qum? Does he have the fierce loyalty of the IRGC hardliners?
And if the top IRGC commanders are dead too from these decapitation strikes?
Then you have a massive power vacuum, and power vacuums in the Middle East are almost always filled by extreme violence. You could see a brutal civil war between different surviving factions of the military. You could see the Artesh, the regular Iranian army, pitting itself against the surviving remnants of the IRGC.
So even the best case scenario of regime change is incredibly bloody and messy.
It's a nightmare. We could be looking at a Syria-style civil war situation, but in a country with 85 million people, massive stockpiles of ballistic missiles and nuclear material.
Let's look at scenario 2, prolonged attrition. The dossier calls this the likely view, giving it a 40 to 60% chance.
This is the cynical historical view.
Yeah.
Regimes are incredibly resilient. You can't just bomb a deeply entrenched ideology out of existence in a single day.
So Iran absorbs these massive hits, moves whatever is left of their leadership and centrifuges deeper underground, and just keeps firing sigil missiles at Dubai and Tel Aviv for weeks.
And we get a grinding stalemate, a messy, highly destructive conflict that completely wrecks the global economy, spikes oil prices, but ultimately doesn't change the political map of the Middle East.
And then there's scenario 3, the nightmare, regional war.
The source gives us a 10 to 30% chance.
This is where those civilian casualties like the devastating strike on the girls' school in Manab really come back to haunt the strategic planners.
If the broader Arab street explodes in anger over images of dead children, If the Gulf states get dragged into a direct shooting war because their airports are being targeted,
Yeah.
if the Houthis in Yemen vastly expand their maritime blockade.
And what if Russia or China decide to actively intervene?
Right. If Beijing or Moscow decide they simply cannot let their primary Middle Eastern partner fall, they might start funneling advanced weapons or real-time satellite intel to Tehran. Then we are looking at the opening stages of a global conflict.
It's a terrifying spectrum of possibilities.
It is. But I want to circle back to the core thesis of our source material today, the fundamental difference between what we are watching today and the failure of 2025.
Go on.
In 2025, the strategic goal was degradation. It was about slowing the Iranian nuclear program down, buying a few years. Today, the goal stated explicitly by both U.S. and Israeli leadership is elimination.
They're not trying to slow the clock. They're trying to break the clock permanently.
That's the reality. And it brings us to the human element of all this. We could sit here and talk about Mach 5 hypersonic missiles and 30,000-pound bunk busters all day, but at the end of the day, there are millions of innocent people on the ground.
Absolutely. You have the Iranian diaspora, people living in Los Angeles or London, obsessively checking their phones, seeing these unconfirmed reports of Khamenei's death, and feeling a surge of genuine hope they haven't felt in 40 years.
And at the exact same time, you have terrified parents in Minab desperately digging through the concrete rubble of an elementary school.
That duality is the absolute tragedy of war. One person's liberation is another person's funeral.
And the question we really had to ask ourselves, the provocative thought to leave you with today as you go back to checking the news, is this. If the Islamic Republic regime actually does fall this weekend, what comes next?
Exactly. We have seen this exact movie before in Iraq in 2003. You topple a dictator, you shatter the state security apparatus, and you create a massive vacuum. Who fills it?
Is it a blossoming secular democracy led by the youth? Is it a harsh military junta led by surviving generals? Or is it pure chaos that destabilizes the entire region for another 20 years?
Are we witnessing the historic liberation of Iran? Or the opening of an apocalyptic Pandora's box?
History suggests it might tragically be both.
It's a really heavy thought to end on, but it is the grim reality we are facing this weekend.
It is.
We've covered a huge amount of ground today, from the strategic failures of the 2025 12-day war to the highly specific capabilities of the F-35I Adir and the B-2 stealth bombers, from the heartbreaking tragedy of the civilian deaths to the cold, hard calculus of the global oil markets and the Strait of Hormuz.
It's an incredibly complex and fast-moving picture.
It is, but I think the main takeaway for our listeners today is this. Do not look at this as just another airstrike in the Middle East. Look at it as the violent culmination of 3 years of escalating signals, broken rules, and failed diplomatic opportunities.
And realize that the outcome of today's operations will absolutely shape the world for your children. Global energy prices, nuclear proliferation, the balance of superpower influence, it is all violently on the table today.
We are going to wrap the deep dive up here, but we will be monitoring the situation constantly. If Scenario 3 happens, if the war expands further into the Gulf, we will be back with an emergency update.
Let's really hope we don't have to be.
Agreed. Let's hope for a swift and stable resolution. Thank you to the expert for walking us through the madness today.
Thank you. Stay safe out there, everyone.
And thank you to you, the listener. Keep your notifications on. History is happening right now. This has been The Deep Dive.